Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Accommodations and Modifications to Curriculum, Meaningful Participation in the General Education Classroom, sponsored by Peak Parent Center and Colorado River BOCES. My name is Pam Christie. At Peak Parent Center, I will be monitoring the chat through the training that's located at the bottom. It looks like quite a few people have already been chatting, so thank you so much. I appreciate that. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a few items on how you can participate in tonight's webinar. You will be muted for most of the presentation, and throughout, if you could ask your questions in the chat, Missy will have breaks throughout this presentation where she will ask if there's any questions in the chat. Closed captioning is available at the bottom of your screen. We are not offering Spanish translation. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Missy Cedars, also with Peak Parent Center. Take it away.
Thanks, Pam. Thanks. So welcome, everybody. Appreciate you joining us in the evening. It's always great to get together with people, even still on Zoom, and not always get to be face to face, but love seeing you all, seeing all the people that we get to talk to every now and then. For those of you that aren't familiar with Peak Parent Center, we are the Parent Training and Information Center for the state of Colorado. So according to IDEA, every state must have a Parent Training and Information Center. We have been around over 35 years. I can never remember the exact number. So we've been doing this a long time. Our home office is Colorado Springs, but we support the whole state. So let friends and family, educators, paraprofessionals know we're here. Most of our services are at no charge to families, educators, and we'll talk more about our services. As I said, my name's Missy Cedars. I am a parent advisor at Peak, as well as doing training. And I have been with Peak for about 10 years at this point. I took a little hiatus in the middle while my oldest daughter was a senior. I have two daughters. My oldest daughter is a neurotypical young lady she's going to college at the University of New Mexico and will be graduating in May with her undergrad in speech and hearing sciences, and waiting to hear from grad schools right now to decide where she's going to go to grad school. So that's exciting. My 18-year-old daughter, I always want to call her 17, but she turned 18 in January. Her name is Krissa, and she is a junior at Air Academy High School here in Colorado Springs. And Krissa experiences a genetic disorder that causes an intellectual and developmental disability. And she is the person that got me involved with, I call them all the P's, Peak Parent Center, Parent to Parent Colorado, and Parents Encouraging Parents that the conference that CDE puts on every year. So that's what brought me to this world, but just really love reaching out, connecting with educators, families, and sharing what we all have to learn. Because although I've been doing this for 18 years with my own daughter and 10 years at Peak, have a lot to learn from everybody. So if you will, in the chat, kind of let me know if you're a parent, a teacher, paraprofessional, other service provider, kind of what role brought you to this session tonight. And it may be more than one, because we often get people that are both parents and professionals in the teaching industry or a service provider. So Pam did email this morning the PowerPoint that I'm going to go through in a PDF format. If for some reason you did not perhaps get that, check your spam. And if not, go ahead and say, I didn't get the PowerPoint, and put your email in the chat, and Pam will check that out so that she can try to resend that. Because, sometimes we either have the wrong email address or goes to spam. So thanks so much. As I said, go ahead and ask questions as we go. We'll try to keep every few slides. I'll check the chat or have Pam let me know if she saw any questions in there. And we'll try to do some at the end as well. But there's, I see a lot of people responding. We got some parents, 9-year-old, got an ELA teacher in a sped school, got another professional. Nice. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate kind of knowing who my audience is today. There is a lot of content, and we'll talk a little bit about the overview here as we go, what accommodations and modifications really are. But the real goal is to making sure that our kids with disabilities, whether we say our kids in terms of you as a teacher or our kids for those of us that are parents, really get meaningful participation in a general education classroom. Because walking in the door, it's just the first step. But it's actually the actual role of accommodations and modifications to make sure that our students can be meaningfully participating in those kinds of classrooms. And really the law that started way even back in the original least restrictive environment law started back in 1975 as the Education for Handicapped Children's Act. Least restrictive environment is really where it said our kids with disabilities, all students with disabilities need to make progress in the general education classroom. And that continued in 1997 and then the update of IDEA in 2004. And heaven knows we're still working at it and we hope they update it again later. So let's talk a little bit about what the law says since we are still working on it. Okay. Federal and state laws require that schools provide accommodations and modifications so that students have access to an appropriate education classroom. And that includes progress in the general curriculum. 504 of the Rehabilitation Act requires that accommodations be provided to students with disabilities, even if they don't have an IEP. And the ADA Act of 1990 said we can't discriminate against people with disabilities. And that's really where the role of accommodations and modifications come in. These are the things that allow these laws to actually be realistic in the world, happen in the world, be executed in the world. And it really gets around to the fact that LRE, when you look at the federal rule around LRE, it said that special classes, separate schooling, or the removal of children with disabilities from the general education environment should occur only if the nature or severity of the disability means that they cannot effectively participate with supplementary aids and services. So supplementary aids and services are very important, and we're going to look at really what do supplementary aids and services mean in our world. So when you talk about supplementary aids and services, it's accommodations and modifications. That's part of what they are. And it allows us to make changes, adapt curriculum so that the content is presented in a way that a student can be effective and their progress can be measured. So when we talk about accommodations and modifications, we're talking about the change to schooling in two ways. One, how a student would take in information, how they get knowledge, and two, how they report knowledge back. And accommodations and modifications help us with that. It's also important to note that those are also included under IDEA or extracurricular activities and non-academic settings. So not only that those classes that your child attends every day during the school day, but what is happening at the school before and after school so that they can participate with non-disabled children to the maximum extent appropriate. And this is one of the places when LRE where we talk about the maximum. We need to look at aids and services so that they can be there as much as possible, not as little as possible as the lower level. And it's really the IEP team or a 504 team, if the student only qualifies for a 504, that as a group decides what accommodations and modifications are needed for that child to succeed. And so it's not, again, just to be in the room, what are needed for that child to succeed. Those supplementary aids and services can be people, they can be places, they can be things. So all of those things, nouns, person, places, and things can become an aid and a service. So the goal is to succeed in the general education classroom. That is what we're trying to do. Let's see. Does anyone have any questions before we start to dive into the actual content of what is an accommodation versus a modification?
What if a school doesn't have the resources?
The resources, yes. Well, I think that's an interesting question because really when we talk about not having resources, whether it's a person, place, or a thing, Then we have to go back to the law says that becomes an administrative issue, and we need to escalate that and say, okay. And part of what we find when schools, school professionals call us, when a parent might call us and say, well, they're telling us they don't have the resources. We say, well, what kind of resource are they currently looking at? And how else might this be done? I think certainly your question is very valid throughout COVID when, and since then, since teaching resources are down, paraprofessionals are harder to get. So what are the other options out there? And the interesting thing about, I love this question, is because one of the other things that COVID did bring to us is the ability, even for rural areas, to access some resources online. And those can be live people resources, live meaning through a Zoom screen. But when we're starting to look at therapists that are providing services remotely, medical systems providing services remotely, reading tutors, math tutors providing services remotely. So not always our first thought that we go to, but how do we start thinking out of the box? When we're talking about that resource, what is it? The bigger question is, what is it we're trying to do with that resource and what other options are there? So definitely a great question about thinking outside the box. And we'll look at some of that today in terms of different options as we talk about what accommodations and modifications are. So thanks for that question. We talk about accommodations. Accommodations are for students with a disability who have an IEP or 504. They're for students without a disability, who have a barrier to learning. And people always ask me, well, like, what is that? So that could be somebody that has a severe allergy or a severe illness that create learning disabilities, even diabetes, students with severe reactions to UV light, like they can't even absorb any UV light, or they get very, very sick. So it really makes their brain not function well. A student who has diabetes, if their diabetes isn't always well controlled, they have a very hard time. Their brains have a hard time taking in information or reporting or showing what they've learned. And so those are some students that may get accommodations as a result of their illness, not necessarily something that we call a disability. Students who receive English language learning services, as you talk about how they are taking in information or reporting it back, well, as they're learning a separate language, they can't always early on take in their information that way or report it back. It's a progress that they learn over time. So they need to have accommodations, meaning some of their materials in different languages as they try to either take in what their new knowledge or show what they've learned. And then really students who are at risk of failure. And I think when this is really interesting because when we learn a little bit more about accommodations, I want you to start thinking about accommodations, particularly if you're a teacher. When we look at the definition of an accommodation, it changes the way we teach or the way a student reports back what they learn, but it doesn't change the instructional content or the performance criteria for meeting a standard. So I really, one of the things that we have as inclusion people, not having resources, that question that you asked, as a team that really supports inclusion, if you start looking at what an accommodation is, an accommodation can be for any student. They are still working at grade level content. They don't have to have an IEP or a 504. If we worked really hard at showing all kids in our classroom, everyone, if there's 30 or 25 or whatever, what accommodations are available to them, then some of our middle range students that don't have disabilities could probably excel because we are not changing the grade level standard. What we're giving them is a different way to take in what they need to learn or to report back, but they're still executing to the grade level standard. So that's kind of a big wow I'd like you to think about, because the more that we as teachers, gen ed and special ed, teach everybody in the school, every student, how to access accommodations and what's available to them, the more time then we have to focus on some students that need more significant modifications. And we'll talk about that shortly. So again, change how I take in information or how I report it back, but I'm still working at grade level content and grade level standards. That's the accommodation. So if we look at what some accommodations are, tests that are taken orally, still the same questions, still on grade level content, but somebody either reads me the question or I read the question and I give them the answer orally, because some of our kids can't write very well, but they know the content, it's in their head. So give them a different way to express what they know. Large print textbooks still at grade level. Additional time to take tests, that's just extending the amount of time they have to process information, but still at the grade level content. A locker with an adapted lock if they can't memorize a combination or use a key. Even something as simple as a home or school communication notebook or a logbook. So sharing information back and forth about what needs to happen and what that student's working on. Peer support for note taking. I think this one's really interesting because we have a lot of kids at school that are excellent note takers. So whoever said without the advent of phones, why couldn't one student take the notes and then before they leave for class, snap the picture of their notes and give them to the other student? Who needs to focus more on listening orally? Who can't write that fast to take good notes? Those kinds of things. Lab sheets with highlighted instructions, graph paper to organize and line up math problems, or even my daughter uses them to practice her handwriting because she has an OT issue and she writes very large. So trying to get her to learn to write inside boxes. I laughed at this when I read it. Tape recorded lectures. I think I should just get rid of the word tape. Who uses a tape recorder anymore? Recorded lectures, copies of teacher notes before a class starts. That's an accommodation for a student who has a hard time taking their own notes. Using their computer for writing, using their voice for writing is just an accommodation if they're still working at grade level standards. So students who have an issue with seeing too much at one time, putting their homework or their assignment in a manila folder with just different strips that they open up just a section at a time. So they're not getting overwhelmed by seeing so much content, but still working at grade level standards. Any questions on a high level view of accommodations before we talk a little bit about modifications? Pam, when I'm looking at this, I have to not have the chat up there. So let me know if you see something. Thanks.
Online school modifications.
Online school modifications, is that the question? So this is going to be very interesting. The way when everybody started going back to school or started going to school online, we've actually modified this presentation. So when we get to this and more of the details, we're going to have no tech, low tech, and high tech. And it was specifically to go with online school issues. So we'll talk through some of those as we move forward. Great question.
That's it.
Okay. Let's talk about what a modification is. So a modification changes what a student is expected to learn or demonstrate. And so this changes the grade level standard. And so while they might be working on a different grade level standard, the subject area remains the same. And that's how come our students that have more significant disabilities can still be included in all of their general education classrooms. They're still in social studies, they're still in science, they're still in art, they're still in that photography class. Whatever every other student has an ability to access, these students can also go because they will have modified curriculum. They may not work at the same pace or at the same level, but they will operate in the same class content. So really, when we have when we know how to do effective modifications, a student should be able to be in any class that's offered to any other student in the school. So we talk about who modifications are for. Students who have traditionally been pulled out into a separate program. That is typically our kids with intellectual, cognitive, and developmental disabilities. Also could be some kids with behavior issues as we start to help them learn how to participate in the general education classroom effectively. Sometimes they still aren't operating at grade level standards. We talk about students who have a low incident disability. Those are usually those with cognitive and intellectual disabilities. They consider those low incidents. And students for whom accommodations have been implemented to the fullest extent, but the student still has difficulty succeeding. And I get a lot of questions. We as parent advisors get a lot of questions about this because they say, oh, when you look at the state standards and what CDE says and what somebody's intellectual level has to be on an IQ test before they can have modifications. Yes, that is in there. And we have to look at what are we all of a sudden going to do? My IQ is 75. It doesn't reach the 70 or 72 number, yet I can't do algebra. And I won't ever be able to do algebra. So at that point, we are going to continue to work to close the gap. We're not going to force them to do algebra. We're going to continue to see what do we need to do differently to close the gap as close as we can. And that will often involve accommodate or modifications. So, and those are kids who have struggled and struggled. I would say that when it comes to the evaluation and gathering data, that's what schools and parents need to do is say, here we have tried this, we have tried that. This is what the data is showing. And we're just not going to be effective putting this child, I don't care what their IQ number says. So now we have to look at functional abilities and functional and adaptive scores. And sometimes it's only subject by subject. We get children who are twice exceptional who may be able to do math off the charts at an 8th grade level. They're a 6th grader, but they can only read at a 2nd grade level. So we're looking at it. It's not a 24/7 thing. It's topic by topic. What does the data show they can do? So I think that's really important. Yes.
So we have 2 questions.
Yes.
Do you have any recommendations for ASD students for their accommodations?
Oh, students with autism spectrum disorder. I'm going to say, I'm going to tell you that that's what I'm assuming. And if you mean something different by ASD, let me know. Couple things, recommendations as we go through some of the examples I'm going to give you to the areas where we put in accommodations and modifications. You'll see some there. There is the Colorado Department of Education has on their website an accommodations and modifications manual. That sucker is a huge manual. And a lot of times what I recommend is families go through that manual, not to pick everything, but to say, I don't even know what an accommodation is for a student that, for my student. So if I get some ideas, then I'll know, oh, here's some things we should do. Depending on the age of the student, I always suggest you ask the student, what do you struggle with in school? That's your first question. Why is either online school hard for you? Why is this particular class hard for you? Understanding, you have to understand first, why is it hard? And then look at what different accommodations might we use for that? And it could be different for every student. And that's a very important distinction. Accommodations and modifications have to be individualized for every student, whether they're on an IEP or a 504 plan, or this is why I said, if we look at accommodations, because they're at grade level standards, any student should be able to use an accommodation because they're not changing the grade level standards. What if we forced all these kids to read all these years a textbook that they could have listened to, and they might have gotten 3 times as much out of it? And most of the textbook writers now, you can get their textbooks online, or you can have a screen reader read a textbook to a student. So great, really good question. So we'll talk some more about that. The other resources that I would say, understood.org online. If you start to just look at, if you just Googled accommodations for students with ASD, there are so many different manifestations of a student who has autism spectrum disorder that's really going to be dependent on that particular student. And so that's why we have to figure out what's hard and then what the accommodation or modification needs to be. Great question. Thank you. Let's look at some examples and then we'll get into some more details. So again, an outline in place of an essay. So instead of writing a whole multi-page essay, which could be the grade level standard, a student could do an outline. They might also do a project instead of a written report. So instead of writing a multi-page report, I'm going to do a PowerPoint presentation, or I'm going to build something that represents what I learned about this particular topic. Kids using picture communication symbols on tests. Well, if you can't read at grade level, they can use PCS, PECs to select different answers. Alternative media and books on the same topic at a lower grade level. Somebody is, reading about, goodness, the guy just escaped my mind. We're reading about some Shakespeare. Well, while Shakespeare is a very high level reading text, there are levels, or there are accessibility. I can't talk today. There are places you can go to get the Cliff Notes on Shakespeare. That's a lower grade reading level that could help a student still learn the same content as their other kids in English, but they're learning at a different level. Using things like spell check or calculators, getting a choice of test answers, and even if a choice is multiple choice, maybe some students only get 3 choices instead of 5. Simpler language and keywords or phrases highlighted. I think what you really want to think about, in a great example, is having gen ed and special ed teachers work together to identify for a topic. And let's talk about cells. Like, let's say we're learning about cells in science. My daughter was learning about cells. Her science class was learning about how cells work in the body. Chris's goal for that particular unit was to draw a cell and label all the different parts of a cell. So she's still in science class with her peers. They're learning a much higher grade level standard, but she's still learning about science. She's still hearing about science. She's still working on experiments with science with her peers. So that's a big modification. Talking about when teachers call me a lot about modifications, or parents call me, what is the easiest way to modify content? Look at, here's our unit. What are the 3 to 5 big ideas a student needs to learn from this unit? So there might be 20 things every other kid is going to have to learn. What are the 3 to 5 big ideas that my student needs to learn? And asking a teacher, what is it that somebody absolutely must know? What is it that is need to know? Second level. And then finally, what is nice to know? And if we can sort our content in the unit to those, for those kids that need significant modifications, we can just focus on what is the absolute must know for that particular child. So there's some examples of that. Let's do a little bit of an overview here, a summary of accommodations and modifications. Again, accommodations can apply to any and all students. And keep that in mind, not just students with disabilities. If you have some of your middle of the road students who are struggling as a gen ed teacher, you may want to think about, how can I teach them about accommodations that might help them learn better and that they can learn to access on their own? Not more work for you, but if we spent 3 days at the first, or 3 hours in that first week of school going, here's all the ways you can access your textbook. Here's how you can get your books to read to you. Here's how you can use speech to text. We may be able to raise the bar for all of our students at grade level versus keeping some of them in the middle because they're too afraid to tell you, I can't understand this textbook. Oh, if I listen to it, I can. So you don't actually change the fundamental standards. Grading is the same. You're grading all students the same, but all we're doing is providing equal opportunity to what I need to learn and to show you what I've learned. Modifications apply to students with disabilities. They do fundamentally change the grade level standard that a student might work at and their criteria. It's designed to allow meaningful and productive participation and learning experiences with our typical peers based on their individual needs and abilities, and the grading is different. They might use the same grading scale, but they're being graded on their alternate standards, the alternate goals that particular student has. That makes sense. But they can still learn science and social studies, language arts, poetry, math, reading, all those things. A little bit of a summary of the differences, more differences. Accommodations focus on removing those barriers. They're designed for those students who can have the barriers removed, and that will help them perform at grade level. Modifications are really ensuring that meaningful participation in the general curriculum, even if it's above their ability level. So if we didn't do modifications, they wouldn't be able to participate and they wouldn't be with their typical peers. And the goal is to say, yes, I can learn something about social studies and science with my typical peers. It's just at a different level. Okay. I'm going to do a quick little you try here. I'm going to show you something and I'm going to show you a little quote. And then you're going to tell me when you read it. I'll read it out loud. Type into the chat if you think it's an accommodation or a modification. So homework limited to a certain number of minutes or hours instead of an amount of work to be completed. Is this an accommodation or a modification? Let me see if I can pop the chat up here. Accommodation. No, got one modification. Okay. Any others want to take a guess? Accommodation. Okay, lots of you say accommodation. And when we originally did this, we had these little papers we would pull out. And it was written up as an accommodation. And the reason it's an accommodation is because just limiting the amount of time a student spends on homework doesn't mean they won't necessarily be held to the grade level standard. And certainly even math is a good example. A lot of times the focus of math homework is tons and tons of repetition, but we have kids that can learn. They might get 30 problems and they're all based on the same content. If I can learn that same content, the grade level standard in 15 problems, it's still then I'm still being graded at I'm still working at grade level. So that's an accommodation. This one's a little bit tricky because the person who said modification, if you're limiting the hours and minutes and not holding that student to the grade level standard, then it becomes a modification. But that's why this one is tricky. And it's really intended to be for those kids that can't do so many hours of homework or it takes them so long, yet they still learn the grade level standards. Then it's an accommodation. So this was written as an accommodation. Little trick in there for you. Back to our little bit of a summary before we dive into some details. Accommodation is the how of instruction. How are we going to get the information to the child and test them? Modification changes the what of the curriculum. What do they need to know to reach their own fullest potential that does not reach that grade level standard? And I think it's really important to understand that both general education teachers and special education teachers are responsible for making accommodations and modifications. Has to be a collaborative effort, particularly as we see our kids get into that middle and high school level, because there are so many subjects and the subjects are so deep. Special education teachers can't know the top 3 to 5 big ideas for every bit of curriculum that's in a middle school or a high school and all the topic areas. So they can sit with a teacher and go, okay, this student, and I'm using 3 to 5 big ideas because my child has an intellectual disability. So that was kind of the max of her ability to learn on a single topic area. Some students that might be 10 items. So that's why it's individualized. Okay, for each student, what is their maximum potential to learn in this content area? I, as the special ed teacher, can help you understand what that maximum potential could be. But you, as the gen ed teacher, I need you to help me modifying the curriculum because I don't know that much about science of cells, the science of cells in the human body. So this is why it's a collaborative effort. Okay. Any other questions, Pam, before we sort of move on to some more details?
We do.
Okay.
What if the school is modifying content instead of giving accommodations?
That's a biggie, and that's probably could be a very one that sounds like a very specific issue around a certain student, and I would probably recommend for a detailed answer to your specific one that you call a parent advisor at Peak. You can call our general number, which Pam can put in there, and just ask for the parent advisor on duty. There's 5 of us. And that gets into a very complex area, even for the school, because they could get in they could get in trouble for doing that when they're not supposed to be doing modifications. But the conversation really needs to happen. Okay, what in this particular class or subject, and again, sometimes it's very subject specific, what is the grade level standard? What data do we have to show that my student can reach it? And the fact is you're not raising the bar high enough. You're not pushing them far enough to get them to the grade level standard. You're actually modifying instead of just doing accommodations. And then if it's like, oh, we have the data to show the student can reach it, what should we be doing different as an accommodation instead of a modification? So a conversation and talking to the student also about, because when I get that question generally as a parent advisor, it's a student who's frustrated, who feels like the content's being dumbed down for them. And they're like, I can do this content, but here's what I need in order to do it effectively. And sometimes it's that, here's what I need, instead of the content being dumbed down, that will help that student change from that modification to an accommodation, if that makes sense.
We have another one, Missy. It's related to the IEP team not knowing how to create effective modifications. It seems they are just making things up as they go. Gen Ed classroom teachers seem to pass this on to learning specialists. The child is being an AC user. It seems like it's been a challenge to implement modifications that honor his voice.
Okay, using alternative communication kind of thing. So a couple things in there. One is I would say that is accommodations and modifications are not taught to all teachers, and they should be. So one of the things that can be included in a student's IEP is education for teachers. And there are certainly there's lots of content out there on, in fact, I have a really good workshop. I don't remember what the name of it. Julie Costin created it. If somebody wants to call me, it's about 100 ways to accommodate anything, or 100 ways to modify, 50 ways to modify anything or accommodate anything. She has two really good different worksheets that talk about the difference of that. So I would kind of start with that. And I would have the question with the IEP team on any areas, school areas, topic areas that need modified or accommodated. At the end of it, and this doesn't happen a lot because we're all in a hurry to get out of the IEP team meeting or the 504 meeting. At the end, okay, here's my students' goals. Okay, tell me now who is responsible for executing the goals. Are you going to have, in each topic area, are you going to have a co-planning session? Is it going to be at the start of every week or the start of every module? Start saying, how is this going to happen? And what is it going to look like? And I think you have to start to say, in order to not let it be haphazard, you have to say, tell me what it's going to look like. Tell me who's going to be responsible for it and by when, and who can I ask about it? How are we going to communicate about it? Those are some really important questions. We get all wrapped up in trying to finish the 504 and finish the IEP, but then we don't go, how is it going to be executed, and ask who's doing it. And then when we get to when we have a responsibility list and who's going to do it by when, then we have something to hold people accountable for. And then if it's not being met, the commitments that they've made, that's when we go up the chain of command and say, I understand there's resource issues, but this is the commitment to our child. This is the IEP and the 504. These are contracts. Who's going to do it? And where do we ask for more resources from? Good questions. So here's the areas that we tend to see the big buckets that where accommodations or modifications can be made. Scheduling and timing, where stuff happens, when it's due, the setting, where it takes place, the actual learning materials or the testing materials, the instructional approaches. How does a teacher communicate or teach this information to a student? Student responses, or how they reply back, how they show what they know, how they do their homework. That's how they provide their information back about what they've learned. And then we talk about presentation. Presentation it's kind of it gets a little bit, it's not necessarily a student presentation. It's a little bit tied into an instructional approach, but how is material presented to a student? So at 3, 4, and 6, often people are like, why do we have those separately? But we'll look at them in each in more detail and you'll see what I'm talking about. And this is where we start to get into our, I forgot my quote here. Nothing about me without me. If you are a parent, if you are a teacher, if you are a service provider, and you're having a struggle figuring out a student's what they need for an accommodation or modification, if the student's old enough, ask them about things that have worked for them. Ask a parent if you're the teacher, what works at home to allow them, because a lot of times we'll have a disconnect between a parent saying, well, my student can do this at home, but why can't they do it at school? Well, let's talk about how are they doing it at home versus how are they doing it at school, or vice versa. My daughter will read all kinds of stuff to the reading teacher at school and she won't read to me at all. It makes me very frustrated. So what's happening there? What are the differences in how that is being done, because those are probably accommodations and modification differences. Also ask their peers. Lots of times, if a student has been working with somebody else, their peers can say, oh, Krista could do this if we do X, Y, or Z. Krista could participate in this activity if we allow her to work this way. So it's amazing that sometimes we, as the adults in the room, can't figure it out. But if we ask the kid themselves or somebody who works with that kid or knows that kid, they can tell us what might be effective. So we're going to look at these in kind of these 3 buckets, as I said. And as we look at each area, scheduling and timing, settings, all that, if you have other ideas that aren't here, because again, this is a very compact list. We had pages and pages of these. Please type them in the chat because you're all smart and we can learn from each other. So all these need to be based on what the individual child needs. We don't just take them all and throw, oh, they need a scheduling and timing adjustment, so we're going to throw all 8 of these ideas into their IEP. No, we're going to look at what that student particularly needs. So no tech, whether that student is learning in school or at home, giving them several minutes before a transition needs to happen, so that they can prepare themselves for that transition. Using a school motto to frame expectations at home. When we've talked about the transition we made from learning in school to online learning, when I talk about a school motto and expectations, like my daughter's was ROAR. So respectful, on task, always safe, and responsible. That's what ROAR stood for. So when we moved her to the home environment, we then looked at, okay, when you're doing school online, what does ROAR look like when you're on your computer? What does it look like when you're on a break between this class and that class? So taking that same expectation and transferring it back and forth can help for kids who are having to learn at home after they've been at school. Using work time and or self-advocacy incentives. So what are kind of those, what's a reward that I could get if I work a certain amount of time, or what are my choices? Self-advocacy, if you can give somebody a choice, students a choice in how to learn this piece of content, then that's always very helpful. No tech solution, maybe a tech solution, but low tech kitchen timers, Google timers, using Alexa and Siri on your phone. Our kids are very, I call that low tech because to some of us that's high tech, but to our kids it's like normal. High tech, embedding digital and body brain breaks into content. People are like, what does that mean? So that can be a short link that they go to and it's a meditation, or if you finish this 10 minutes of content, then you get to go look at the San Diego Zoo and you can go look at the polar bears because they're really cool to look at the San Diego Zoo, and it doesn't matter where you're at. You can see them. Using visual scheduler apps for Android and Apple PC. So something that is visual for a student that can't tell time or doesn't want to tell time, that keeps track of time for them. And website blockers to aid focus. One of the challenges of students learning online is that it is so easy to access all the other pop-up ads, the distractions, but there are actually blockers that take all of that away and just focus on the main content. Again, if you have other ideas of how you as a teacher or you as a parent have modified schedule or timing or helped your students stay on task, pop those in the chat so we can all learn from them. Settings, the place where a student learns or where they show what they have learned. No tech, a space with all tools available, including their fidgets, their snacks, their drinks, whatever they need. And this was a big one in the transition from school to home, having a basket or something that says, okay, it's school time and everything I need is right here. I'm ready to go. So I'm not distracted by trying to get what I need. Allowing work to be done individually on or off camera. Again, for a student who's learning online, this is sometimes something that had to be negotiated. But some of our kids who get to be teens, they do not like to look at themselves online. It makes them very uncomfortable and unable to focus. And so sometimes that had to be negotiated with a teacher, because I know teachers wanted to see that kids were on time and on task. So even having a check-in period, say, okay, I'm going to listen to the lecture. And then when it's time for you to give the homework assignment, I will turn the assignment for me to start. I'll turn my camera on. I'll tell you I understand, or I'll ask the questions. And then they get to turn their camera off while they finish. And then they have to have a check-in before the end of the class, so that so that there was confidence that they were engaged in the learning. Low tech, fluorescent lights, add natural lights. Sometimes don't have natural windows because kids wanted to look outside. So, and then these same things can be used in school. So if your student always goes to sit by the window because they want to stare out the window and they're not paying attention in class, that's something to have a conversation with the teacher saying, my student needs to sit somewhere else because that window is too much of a distraction. Using headphones or earbuds to ward off noise, using it as a reward. Sometimes in the setting, hey, once we start your homework assignment, you can have the music on as long as I see you're on task. Wobble chairs, exercise bands, those kinds of things are called low tech. But for our kids that have fidget issues that need some movement, that can allow them to focus on their learning. High tech, kids with sensitive OT issues, one-click mouses. There are some very inexpensive touch laptops now where you can touch the screen instead of having to try to use a mouse if you can't manage it. And styluses can help our kids who are not as precise with their fingers or mouse movements use a computer. Doing instructions and testing in small groups or individually, using, even if it's an online learner, chat rooms, but only use those as needed. And we say that because we want those kids interacting, conversing, hearing from, learning with their typical peers as much as possible. In the world of materials, paper materials for all books and lessons, some kids, and I actually had a call like this the other day. They're making my kid do everything on the computer, and he does so much better when he has paper. But they said they are, they're a one-to-one school, so every kid has a computer. I'm like, well, just because they're one-to-one doesn't mean they have to use the computer. So we can still provide paper. It's still there. Getting the copies of teachers' notes before or after a lesson, reading in advance. These are the ways that we can help accommodate curriculum for students. Graphic organizers, and these are typically written or a PowerPoint slide of how ideas are related, help our kids. Getting pictures of another student's notes after class because I can't keep up. I have to, I have a friend who has a son that had a hearing impairment. And so he couldn't take notes because he needed to be reading the teacher's lips because he couldn't hear everything the teacher said, even with his audio system. So that's a great time where getting a picture of another student's notes would be helpful because he couldn't pay attention to the teacher and take notes at the same time. Doing these reading guides for students that can't look at a whole bunch of content. I mean, it can literally be a plastic piece of tape, long piece of fat plastic tape, and you put highlight in the middle and the student slides it up and down. It can be a ruler, but even fat plastic tape can be used to make a reading guide for a student. Printing of materials instead of reading online. That I said that's high tech because you have to have a printer, and some of our families at home didn't have access to printers. Using things like Google Read and Write, Windows Narrator, or other screen readers. It is really amazing the number of kids that even if they can read at grade level, they are not taking in the whole grade level content when they read it, but when they hear it, it is dramatically different. So that's pretty important. And Chrome extensions that reduce page clutter when reading or searching. An example of that is Just Read for Chrome. It gets rid of, again, some of that. It's kind of what I said before, those screen readers that take away some of the extra. So we're not keeping our kids in the state of distraction. So if you as teachers of parents had other ideas that helped your students absorb materials easier, please share those in the chat. Instruction, and actually how we deliver instruction, teachers deliver instruction using sign language interpreters, paras, thinking time for on-the-fly discussion questions. So this one was really interesting during the online schooling that I found. It seemed like teachers who were teaching when they taught live in their classrooms, they were much better about giving thinking time to students. Something about the interaction of the computer really shortened that thinking time. And some of that could be is, okay, I'm going to give you, it's kind of like how we might use what we call a waterfall in the chat. I'm going to give you a question that I want you all to answer, but nobody put an answer in until 2 minutes is up, and I will tell you when that is. And that allows all students then to have more time to come up with their answers before everyone enters their answers. So they're not the last one every time. Scheduled check-ins, just helping students, knowing when or where, how they're doing with instruction. This was really became important because scheduled check-ins happened automatically in live school a lot of times with a student as they were coming in and out of the classroom, didn't so much in online learning. So we had to really formalize that. Simplify and write out multi-step directions. This was another area where I found in live school, teachers and, in in-person school, teachers are really good about writing out instructions on the board. They were not so. They were giving out so many verbal instructions during online lessons. So using things like the Zoom whiteboard, the Microsoft Teams whiteboard to write them out. I just saw a lot of kids really asking more questions about assignments, or if they're using a PowerPoint agenda, put more details in there. They're just doing everything verbally, and some kids couldn't catch it fast enough and still can't. High tech, using things like Microsoft Quick Assist for paras to control laptops. For some of our kids with disabilities, they can't manage the laptop on their own. So the paras could learn to take over a student's laptop and help them get to where they need to be. Turning on closed captioning in Zoom and Teams. This should have been an automatic thing for our kids that can't listen as well but can read faster. Very high-tech solution. Also, Zoom, Teams, really easy to record lessons these days, if you're doing online school. Getting permission to record the lesson so the student could go back later and hear it. And for some of our kids just with hearing issues, or what I found is some of the school laptops are not good at broadcasting sound. And so it was really hard to hear the teachers. It was too soft. You could never get it loud enough using a speaker or headphones. Student responses. So in terms of how students show what they know, allow teachers to be given, allow answers to be given orally was a big one. Use a response scribe so that teacher or that student tells somebody else the answer and they write it down. Varying the test approaches. Don't just do a single kind of test, using recognition where I could circle things, check boxes, true and false, multiple choice matching. Very much could be a modification or an accommodation depending on what grade level standards. Allowing alternate responses for homework. This is definitely a lot of times more of a modification. Replacing summative assessments. So big, long tests with some kind of a report or a project can be a great accommodation or modification. Using the chat box to respond for nonverbal students became a big deal because in the online world, if they couldn't participate orally. Recording a video to tell what you know can be an alternative way to show what you know. And certainly using speech to text and text to speech apps in terms of how students respond. I'm going to keep track of my time here. I'm on the last one, presentation of materials. Low tech, making more white space on the page, bigger fonts, less words. Using symbols that help a student follow directions such as arrows and stop signs. Here's where we start, here's where we end. Ask less questions, but select them to measure all required content. So if you're working at the grade level standards, I can still get it all done in 15 questions versus 30. If we write good questions, we can probably do that. One less answer in multiple choice. Low tech using things like symbol sticks, which is definitely a modification. Usually there's not really high level content done with symbol sticks. And once again, clean up those web pages with things like Just Read for Chrome. So why are we using all this? What we really want to do is remove those barriers for any and all kids, not just our kids with disabilities, so they can demonstrate mastery. With both approaches, we really need to keep expectations high. And that gets back to that person's question around my students getting modifications when they really should be getting accommodations. Something's not going right with the expectations there for that student and the bar that's being set for them. So we need to figure out what to do differently. I'm going to skip my little UTARI here. This is a little bit of information about Peak. So you'll have our phone number if you want to call a parent advisor. We do have a website. We have a Speak Out blog if you sign up for our mailing list. We do have Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We love to share on our socials and really want to talk to you about, especially we do educational surrogate parent training. So if you know some school districts that need some ESPs, they can participate in our trainings. We're getting ready to do some more tips for middle school and high school transition for families or educators. But the big one, our annual conference on inclusive ed is back live April 17th and 18th. We want you all there. Come to Denver, come see us. We've missed you. Any other questions real quick, Pam, in our last minute? I did give you some extra accommodations and modifications on your last slide, so you have more ideas.
What is presented in the conference?
Oh, my goodness. Let's see, it's 2 days of excellent speakers. I don't have my agenda right in front of me. Who are some of our—
It's on our website.
Yes.
So we have a opening keynote, Michael Murray, Ignite Opportunities for Inclusion. And then this is the 17th, and then we have some breakout sessions. We have a youth panel on Monday, more breakout sessions. Look at our website. We have all of it is up on our website. So please.
Yeah.
Please
I was going to see if I could real quick get to drop the link in the chat.
That'd be great, Missy.
So
real quick, I'm going to wrap up. You'll receive a training evaluation after this presentation. We would appreciate if you would take just a minute to complete that and provide your feedback as we strive to improve Peak services. On behalf of the sponsors, Peak Parent Center and Colorado River BOCES, thank you for attending our webinar. And again, I put the contact information in the chat. If you have any other questions that we weren't able to answer, please contact any parent advisor at Peak. Our website is www.peakparent.org. Missy put that in the chat. Thank you, Missy. If you have any further questions, please reach out. Missy is going to look for that 50+ ways to implement from Julie Cosson. And I will send that just to everybody on the list. If you don't mind, I will send that to everyone that registered, just like you received the PowerPoint today.
Yeah. Awesome. And I'll, when I send it, I'll send over Julie's website because she has a lot of great free resources.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.